Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Nick Thompson. You may know me from Netflix Love is Blind, but on this podcast, we sit down with guests from all walks of life to hear their story, remove stigmas, and uncover what makes them tick. Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Conversations with Nick Thompson. You're actually going to get a little bit of a different experience today, taking a break for the holidays, but I didn't want to leave you hanging, so I am going to give you an episode here that is more of a mashup between myself and Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick, who has been on this show previously, where we talked about attachment styles and the role they play in relationships. She and I did an Instagram Live a few days ago on boundaries and the role that they play in your relationships, from work, for family members, friends, and even in relationships. So this Instagram Live was a little bit of us doing an introduction, but then actually taking questions from the listeners. So I thought it would be great for us to drop this as an episode this week in case you missed it and you're interested in hearing some of the questions that both of our followers had on boundaries and the different types of boundaries and really how you can apply them to your life. And then, with questions from people, real people on our Instagram following, and how they can apply some of these learnings in their real day life. So I hope you enjoy this little bonus episode. It's a little bit of a different format, but enjoy, have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you in January with a brand new episode. Thanks.
Hello.
That means you can see me. That means we figured this out. As boomers, we did it.
Whoa. I'm a millennial.
Speak for myself. Hey,
I'm a
we're
millennial.
the same year as you, so.
We're millennials. We're the upper echelon of millennials.
Why do we keep acting like boomers?
I
Not that there's anything wrong with a boomer. Now I'm going to get all these angry DMs about how I'm talking shit on boomers. Sorry.
Well, what I was going to say is I just feel like we're acting like millennials. We're not acting like Gen Z. But now we're going to get all the Gen Z hate.
Okay. Well, either way, we're going to get hate, but we already know that about ourselves. So here we go. That's where we set boundaries, right? Appropriate boundaries prevent the impact of that.
Exactly right. Hey, everyone. Oh, my gosh. I love that light. Is that new? The relatable light?
The relatable, yeah. Oh, yeah. This wasn't all set up when you recorded. We got to record again so you can be part of the relatable relationships.
We'll have to do that. We'll have to do that.
We will.
Okay, so I'm going to ask everyone for like a teeny tiny bit of grace because I have never done an Instagram Live by myself before. Not that I'm doing it by myself, but like operating it by myself.
Here's my boundary.
So
yes, please do give us grace.
Cool. And we're going to get started here in just a second. But for those of you who are here, thank you for coming. This is awesome. Liz and I were chatting the other day, well, I think like a week ago now, maybe 2 weeks ago, about like boundaries and how important they are for your mental health, but also about around the holidays as you're spreading yourself incredibly thin to hit different family members, different friends, your own peace of mind and space. So we thought it'd be a good idea to have a nice conversation live with you all here. So thank you for coming.
Yes.
And I think we can go ahead and get started, I think. But what I wanted to say real quickly to everyone here is we're just going to do a quick overview of boundaries, like what they are, the different types, what's healthy, what's not healthy, and then really open this up for all of you to ask questions. So obviously, it's a buzzword, right? Like I think we've all heard it, but like don't know exactly what it is, like what's healthy, what's not. So we'll quickly dive into that, but really want you guys to ask questions. So hopefully we can help you, understand a little bit better how this can benefit you, or understand how to make it more healthy, or understand how to communicate it to the people that are in your life. And I think that's going to be, our main focus here.
Yes,
you have anything
putting the disclaimer on it that this is not therapy. This is not clinical guidance. You should seek help from a mental health professional if you are having concerns with family members, relationships, all of those things. Nick and I are here as friends, as colleagues, as people who are passionate about this topic, just to provide some insights. and somebody has a boundary not to call them a boomer. So I apologize for that. But yes, we're not at all here for clinical guidance. We're just here to chat about what are boundaries, why they matter. And to Nick's point, for sure, over the holidays, but in general, boundaries can be such a difficult thing because we feel like we're being mean. We feel like we're being cold when we set boundaries. And so learning how to set boundaries in an appropriate way is a really effective tool.
I completely agree. And I can tell you just from my personal experience, like I did not ever set boundaries until 5 years ago. And it has made me feel so much better just in general. Like I feel like I'm actually in control of my time and, all of that stuff. So we'll get in that, but why don't we get started? I feel like this is going to be a little bit of like a live podcast format for a few minutes here. So I want to actually ask you, Liz, what the heck are boundaries, like defined clinically from, your expertise?
Sure. Yeah. So boundaries being the limits that we put around ourselves. And so they are, they're not a brick wall that we put around ourselves, but if you think about putting a fence around ourselves. And so it's very clear guidelines as to what we expect out of others, what we're okay with from others, but also that there is some flexibility to them. And so I describe it, even if you see a property that has a do not trespass sign on it, you could technically jump past that sign. The sign in and of itself is not stopping you, but it is a very clear warning of where you can and can't go, and that there will be consequences if you do choose to ignore the sign. And so that boundaries really are that the limits that we place around us of what we are comfortable with and what we're willing to tolerate from others. How did you find it when you started setting them? What was that conversation even with your therapist, or, like how was it described to you?
Yeah. So I give a lot to people, and sometimes, looking back, I would realize like I would give so much that I wouldn't have anything left for myself. And I always use the silly thing where it's like, oh, if you have a cup of water and you're giving your water to everyone else, but you're not refilling your cup, like you're out of water pretty soon. And it's very basic, but I'm very empathetic. So I would give a lot to people who were in need. And I just remember there was this one point where I found myself like I was on the phone with someone every day about the same issue they were having, and I was just exhausted with it. And, listening and taking that on myself. And I asked about it in therapy, but I also just like started researching. I'm like, I like this person. I care so much for this person. I can't do this every day. Like it was just taking it out of me. And so I started learning about it. And then I was like, oh, and then I started applying what I was learning about how, hey, like it's okay to say like, I don't have the mental capacity or the space to deal with this right now. And I started applying that to friends, family, work, other areas in my life. And I'm not perfect at it, but I'm a lot better at it now. So I think, once you identify what's happening in where you can set a boundary, like that's step 0 almost, because then you've got to figure out what's healthy, figure out what type, figure out what's fair. And then of course, like alleviate the guilt that comes with doing it, because that's I think a big part of it.
Yeah. And big part of it is also considering like circle of control. And so to your point, if you have people who are constantly taking, I'm a big believer in that givers have to set limits because takers rarely do. Takers are going to take. And so givers have to be aware of the toll that is taking on them when they continue to give in that way. And when we think about it in terms of circle of control, so what you have direct influence over, somebody can want something from you as much as they want, and they can try to take that thing from you as much as they want. But where the resentment actually comes in is when you choose to give it to them or choose to allow them to continue to take when you could say no. And so that is a really good check-in question on if you're feeling resentment towards somebody or feeling taken advantage of, feeling used, checking in on what is my role in this and where could I have kind of deterred this and said no along the way.
I think that's so smart. I just want to point out to everyone, so I'm seeing the chat here. There's a question button. If you have a question, I'm going to try and get these ones in the chat too, but if you have a question, can you hit the question button for us? It's just going to help us navigate out people joining, people leaving, all of that stuff as well. So thank you for that. So what I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to be fully transparent, we worked on a reel for this, and I didn't know there were three different kinds of boundaries until you sent me the three different kinds of boundaries. So can you share with everyone like the three different types of boundaries?
Yeah, for sure. So we have our rigid boundaries. This is when we're literally putting the brick wall up around us. And so you can't see over it. They can't see over it. These aren't really boundaries at this point. It's being guarded. And so it's a really hard and fast. And there are certain things in our lives that we are going to have hard and fast boundaries on. What we're comfortable with in terms of, wherever that shows up. But a rigid boundary is that there's no flexibility. It is what it is. A porous boundary is the complete opposite of that. So it is overly flexible. It's more of a suggestion more than anything else. You can think of this like maybe putting a hula hoop around you versus the brick wall. It's like you can see it's there, but it's not actually going to stop anything. And then the middle is the healthy boundaries. And these healthy boundaries truly they're flexible and you're willing to change them. And they ebb and flow based on your comfort level and based on life experiences, based on you changing your mind. But a healthy boundary is very clear. It comes with consequences if it's violated, but there's also a willingness to kind of sit with it and renegotiate in certain situations.
I think that makes perfect sense. And again, like I had no idea until you wrote that over to me the other day. So I think go ahead.
Would you tend to fall in like the porous category then? Like where do you think you fell prior?
Well, I think it's been a journey and it depends. For me, I know like sometimes I am harsh, like this is it. Like this is what you get, this is what you don't get, or you get nothing and that's it. And then I feel like I fall a little bit into what I already forgot what it was called.
Porous.
The one where it's a suggestion.
Oh, yeah.
It's a suggestion. Like I would really like it if you don't text me or call me after 10, let's just say. But if you do and I'm in the mood, I might respond, I might not, like that kind of thing. I might take the call, I might not. But I think most people probably have a little bit of all three.
Yeah, I would say the people who struggle with boundaries tend to be more porous. I think that ties into our societal norms and expectations of it being a positive thing to be a giver, which of course it is. It's positive to take care of the people in our lives, but when it starts to come at the cost of your well-being, it's no longer positive, at least not for you.
Right. So what I want to ask you, again, for your expertise here, what is healthy? What is not healthy when you're setting boundaries, especially when you're getting started, which I feel like a lot of people probably are? And just before you answer that, there's so many people asking if they're a millennial or saying they're a Gen Xer. You guys are hilarious. Like, I don't even know. I'd say it's like probably 83 or 4, but I don't know. I guess I'll Google it. But
okay, so we know what the next topic of our Instagram Live is, right? Because
right.
That's clearly what's getting all the attention. So the difference with healthy and unhealthy is you sitting with what you feel comfortable with in certain situations. You really sit and assess and reflect on, is this going to be self-betrayal if I do this thing? Or is this going to isolate me from loved ones in the way that I don't want to be isolated if I set too harsh of a boundary? And so really determining healthy boundaries are where your body, your nervous system can feel most at peace. Now, when you're first starting to set the boundaries, you're likely not going to feel at peace. But a good way to gauge this is that after you set the boundary, after the awkwardness of that is over, how are you now feeling? So to your point, if it comes to the please don't text me after 10 p.m. and somebody continues to do it, so you have to have more of a serious conversation of, I feel disrespected when you violate my boundary and do that. And that feels uncomfortable, but then when you stop receiving those texts after 10 p.m., your nervous system gets to relax because now you can feel safe in that. And so that's a really good way to assess, like, if it's a healthy or necessary boundary of like, how is it activating your body? Which I would imagine, like, when you're talking about, struggling with maybe overly giving, that probably would activate your nervous system. It creates this cognitive dissonance of, I want to do this because I'm a good human and I like to show up for the people I love, but it also creates a discomfort when I know that I'm running out of water in my cup.
Right. And I think that's so relatable. If it's okay, I found a question here in the chat I thought was really good. And thank you to the people who are helping sort of guide how this works. So here's a question. I don't want to shut out certain family members completely. I just want to know how not to shift my energy towards a negative space when that family member does what they do to me. So I guess that's kind of, again, like, where do you start, especially with family where it's probably really difficult, especially around the holidays?
Yes. So I would even come up with a few things of knowing in advance. Is it the topics that they bring up that's violating your boundary? It's how much time they want of you. If it's how much money they're expecting you to spend on something, like, first really identify what it is that feels like a violation. And then once you're able to identify that, so let's say it's time. Maybe they're expecting you during the holidays to be over there every weekend through the holidays, and that just doesn't feel feasible or good to you. So it's first determining that, what is feeling like the violation, and then sitting with what could feel like a good compromise for me. What could I tolerate and be okay with? Because again, healthy boundaries are about compromise. It doesn't mean that we're always doing what we want when we want all of the time. It's finding a middle ground. It's finding the gray area of, I'm okay with this, but I'm not okay with all of that. And so when you determine then, okay, maybe I'm not okay being over there all weekend, every weekend, but maybe I'll give you 2 weekends. And then it's communicating that to them in whatever way. You have to keep in mind as well that people don't always want to receive your boundary. People aren't always going to like them. They're going to be annoyed or put off by it. That doesn't make it wrong.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the hardest thing that I had to overcome. And I actually, just this last weekend, I was with my sisters and my nephew. We took my 6-year-old nephew to the zoo lights here in Chicago. And we had a conversation about Christmas. And they're like, are you coming to mom's? My parents were divorced, to mom's on New Year's Eve. And I said, well, the last 2 times I came on New Year's Eve, mom went to bed at 7 like she does, and you guys didn't show up. And I sat there by myself, where I'd be much more comfortable sitting there by myself in my own space. And so I said, I will come if there's going to be activity and we're going to enjoy each other's company. But if I'm going to be sitting in the family room by myself, like, I will see you Christmas morning. So that was my boundary right there. And I just laid it out. But I can tell you, it took me 3 years of sitting there by myself to be able to come up and say that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess the next step to that is then what is the consequence? So you set the boundary, and if it's not adhered to, then what is the consequence to that? Because boundaries without consequences are merely suggestions. And so you could be suggesting that repeatedly, but what's your follow through if in fact it goes the way it has been?
If that happens again, they'll never see me on Christmas again.
They'll never see me again.
No, that's a good question. I hadn't thought about the consequence. I guess I'm just expecting to take them at their word, and I guess we'll see. And I'll check in with all of you on December 26th.
Well, and so I think that's where it gets tricky with boundaries at times, is because we do just expect that people are going to respect them, because that would be the respectful thing to do. But unfortunately, boundaries would not be such the buzz topic that they are if it were that cut and dry, just to say, this is what I need from you, and the other person says, oh, okay, sure, I got you. That's usually not how it goes. And so that would be, so we talked about figuring out what you're comfortable with, figuring out what you're willing to compromise on, and then figuring out what the consequences if somebody does not adhere to the boundary. So just a brief example for that would be, let's say you have a friend who's always late. So they always show up late to dinner. You know, you meet,
I gotta
relatable.
Check make sure none of my friends are on this, because they'll be like, Nick, you're getting boundaried tomorrow.
Oh, you're the late one?
I'm always a little late.
Okay, so fair. So let's say they're your friend says, Nick, if you're more than 10 minutes late to dinner tomorrow night, I'm going to get up and leave. I'm not going to wait. That is the consequence. So the compromise is, I'll give you a few minutes. Look, Nick, I love you. I know it's kind of part of who you are. Fine, I'll give you 10 minutes. If you're any more than 10 minutes late, though, I am going to get up and leave. Ooh, what does that feel like? That's crazy.
Oh, I mean, yeah. It's weird. I'm one of those people, I always think I can do one more thing before I leave, but I digress. We've got some really good questions here too. So I want to ask this one. This is the hardest one for me is, what do you do when your health care employer doesn't accept your boundaries? So let's just say employer in general, and sorry to do that, but I think that's a really big one.
So when your just employer in general does not.
Yes. So let's say, for example, I am not answering my email on Saturday or Sunday, or I am only working my scheduled shift. I'm not staying late, something like that.
So that is within your circle of control. Let's go back to circle of control. If that is your boundary and your boundary is within the limits of your job description, if your job description does not state anywhere that you're required to answer emails on the weekend, then you're allowed to say, not only do I not answer, I don't even check emails on the weekend. Now that's up to you to stick to, because if you're tempted to respond, if you check them, then that's on you, circle of control. But if that's not within your job description and you don't even check them, you got to set that boundary with yourself as well. But really, when it comes to employment or relationships or environments, it comes down to acceptance or change. Because if you know your employer is going to continue to violate your boundary, and as your employer, and they have the authority, they feel like they have the upper hand, if they continue to do that, you can either accept this is just who they are, so I can focus on what I have influence over, but this job is worth it to stay, or you can focus on change. And maybe that job no longer works for you, and that means you're going to have to start applying for other things. And people's response to that often is like, well, the benefits or the pay, or like, I'm powerless because of that. You're not powerless. You may have to take a pay cut. You may not have as good of benefits. All those things may be true, but you're not powerless. You're able to make a change if you so choose. You basically decide what can you tolerate.
I'm noticing, like, and I haven't really thought of it this way before. I'm learning too. Accountability, like within yourself, is super important, because if you can't enforce it and you can't know when to walk away from a relationship, from an employer, from a family member, like at some point, like that's on you. I mean, it really has to be on you. It's hard, and that's so hard. And I hate thinking of it like that myself, but that's kind of how it is.
It really is. And as long as you continue to take a victim stance to that, and I don't mean that dismissive, I don't mean that insensitively, but if you truly continue to have a victim mentality around these situations, that you are powerless and there's nothing you can do about it, you will continue to feel powerless. Now, is it sucky if you have to walk away from good pay and good benefits because your employer doesn't respect your boundaries? Absolutely, that's sucky. But you're not powerless, and you get to choose that. You get to choose either I'm going to keep this, or I'm going to choose my boundaries, and that's up to you. But really, bottom line, coming down to, like you're saying, accountability of knowing what you have influence over and respecting that.
What's a good approach for someone who is very much knowing that they have to have boundaries, knowing that to set them, knowing they have to enforce them, but like just not having the confidence to do so? Because I think that is also very prevalent.
Yeah, and that's really where working with a mental health professional becomes so important, because that often comes down to your core beliefs, and your core beliefs are the lens through which you see the world, and they've been instilled in you from really young childhood. And so if your belief is that I don't have a voice, that I am powerless, that my opinion doesn't matter, if that is the belief you're walking around with, that's how you're going to show up in these situations. And so working with a mental health professional to really start to change those beliefs then starts to change the confidence level around, like, no, I am worth being respected. My opinion does matter. But then it takes a lot of practice. Like, I do assertiveness practice and training with a lot of my clients when it comes to boundary setting, because knowing the verbiage and then being willing to assert the verbiage is really hard and really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy.
What is some of the verbiage you use when you set a boundary? So like if you are maybe setting a new boundary with a friend, how might you word it?
So for example, I've gotten much better lately, like in the last couple of years, where I will, so for example, I have a group chat, and I hope no one's on here again, but I have like 50 group chats, and I hate group chats because if you're not on it, you're far behind, and then it's too far gone, in my opinion. So one of the things that I finally did was I was like, hey, everyone in this group chat, like, when I'm working, when I'm busy, like this is just not a priority. So if there is something that like needs my attention, you have to text me separately. Because when you've got 5, 6 people in a chat and you're away for an hour, there's like 2 million chats that you've completely missed. And it's like, I miss, oh, we want to do this on Saturday. We want to go to a game. We want to go, have a barbecue or go grab drinks or go to brunch or go to the museum, whatever it is. I miss that. And then you're just lost.
Yeah.
And then the more lost you get. So I said, I'm like, if there's plans or something you desperately need my personal attention on, you got to text me separately, because otherwise, like, I'm not going to go read a whole bunch of. And by the way, like in the group chat, there's a lot of nonsense. We're trolls. They're talking about sports, and that's not a priority for the minute. You got 200 messages about it, stuff like that. So I think for me that's a big one. Is like I just said, if it needs my attention, you got to text me separately, because then it's not me scrolling through messages for 20 minutes trying to figure out what happened.
And have they respected that?
Yeah, it took some time for all of us to kind of like figure out how that needs to work, but yeah.
Okay.
I think so. Yeah.
Because then the question is, what becomes the consequence if they don't? That you're like, then don't expect.
Well, I'm like, I have other plans.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm like, I have other plans. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. That's a beautiful consequence.
Yeah. So we had a whole bunch of
right,
questions come in since I said, but I just want to get through this chat real quick, and then I'm gonna go to the other questions. Okay, here we go. I'm going into these. All right. How can we set boundaries with friends and family when it comes to struggling with anxiety and panic attacks? What is a way to not talk about triggering topics without offending others? Good question. Deep question. Probably do a whole live on that. But go ahead.
That is part of boundaries, is determining what you're willing to talk about, what you're comfortable talking about, and what you're not. And there's a time and place to talk about hard topics that might be more triggering and create anxiety, and there's time and place that are not. And so having your verbiage prepared in terms of like, hey, yeah, that's not something I'm comfortable talking about right now, or can we maybe talk about that later? Having something prepared of what you can say when that comes up, but also keeping in mind that just because someone brings up the topic doesn't mean you have to engage. And so I call it the script. I have my clients work on creating their scripts when they go into a situation where they know they might be asked some things that they're not comfortable talking about. So it's already ready to go. You don't have to overthink it. Practice it in the mirror. Be prepared to go. People's reaction to it is their business. So if they're like, come on, or just to share with us, they get one verbal warning of, I'm not comfortable talking about this. And if it persists, then the consequence is getting up and removing yourself from the situation. People are going to call you dramatic. People are going to give you a hard time about it. Okay, so be it. But if you truly don't want to talk about it, that's how you set and hold a boundary.
I agree. And I don't know if this is going to be helpful for this specifically, but one thing that I've started doing, and I've learned to do, like, this is not easy, is remembering that when someone is, coming at you or attacking you or triggering you, like, they are a lot. Yes, you might be triggered, and you're responsible for, like, removing yourself, right? But at the same time, like, a lot of times when they're coming at it, it's projection, and it's not about you. And if it is, it's like then you're like, well, or if you think it is, then it's like, well, now you're bullying. And then guess what? Bullying is about the bully, not the person being bullied. So it's like, it's the same type of concept there. And I feel like it's important for people, myself included, to be able to have the strength and power to remove yourself and put yourself in a situation. I was doing some writing yesterday, and I was thinking about the holidays, and I called this like the bathroom breather. I go to the bathroom to take breathers from the family. It's special. The more there are, the more breathers I need. And so, learn to be comfortable removing yourself and putting yourself in a space where you're just like that Ben Affleck meme where he's like outside smoking, and he's just like, like, it's one of my favorites.
Yeah. I totally agree. That's a great suggestion.
So we have another another good question here. This one I think is relatable to every single person in the world, at least at some point in their life. What are we supposed to do when we feel so addicted to a person that you cancel yourself for that person? I'm thinking like you lose yourself for that person. That means you have boundaries aren't even in your vocabulary if that's happening.
So
Yeah.
Facing Love Addiction is a really great book on this topic. And Facing Codependency, also both of those. I think it's maybe Pia Melody that does those. Those are a great approach. Also, a mental health therapist is where, if it's to that point where you are that intertwined with somebody, then there's something likely going on with an insecure attachment style that needs to be addressed on a clinical level. And I would say that if you know that, so if you're asking the question, you have self-awareness around it, which is a beautiful thing. And so checking in on, are there certain situations that trigger that make me, make that become more activated for me? Is there something maybe that partner is doing that I feel unsafe? I'm really assessing what makes that happen more often than not, and then starting by addressing that. But the work is going to have to be done first and foremost on your attachment style, because that is what's being activated when you get that sucked into somebody.
And I want to, I don't know if you have an answer, and I don't expect you to. We live in a very interesting world, but like one thing I've been thinking about lately is how I have had the luxury of seeking therapy weekly, bi-monthly, sometimes 2-3 times a week the last, year and a half. What advice do you have, or where can someone start who maybe doesn't have access to a mental health care professional?
It's really comes down to then the resources you seek out. So whether it's that you're seeking out books or journal articles, or ensuring that they are from a credible source, of course. But if you don't have access to one, it's also finding maybe there's something that's state funded. Maybe there are support groups. Maybe there's church groups. Maybe there's different ways that you can just get community and you can be able to process through some of these things. But when it comes to, making therapy more affordable, that's out of my realm. That's not, I'm not on the political side of all that. And so I think that it's really more about finding the resources that can support what you're going through if you don't have access to it. And then also searching for, there are a lot of scholarship programs, and there's a lot of different programs that are set up for people who can't afford therapy. It takes some research, but a lot of that is out there.
Yeah, I actually just, and I don't know a lot about it, but I just got introduced today to an organization that, and once I learn more, I will definitely share this as a resource. An organization that gives you basically a person that will listen to you for free or a donation of your choosing, and it's a not-for-profit. And I'll be sharing more about that as I learn more about that. But I think to your point, it's not our job, and everyone here hopefully knows, I think everyone should have access to healthcare. Not even access. Everyone should have healthcare, mental health care included. We'll do the politics another time, but there are resources out there. And, I can tell you the first time I stuck out a therapist, I didn't have health insurance, and I found one that was able to see me for basically a copay at the time. So they are out there, and I know it's hard, and I know that seems sometimes like it's the weight of the world to just take that first step. But like even to Liz's point, read a book, follow on Instagram. I learn so much or find so many things relatable just by following various therapists and mental health professionals and healthcare professionals on Instagram. And I know it's not therapy, it's not a replacement for therapy, but it can sometimes just be validating, sometimes give you that prompt you need to take that step. So don't forget to do that. I just want to say, too, there's a bunch of questions in here about people violating boundaries. I think we kind of covered that, so I don't want to act like we're not covering that, but just keep in mind, like, you have to have consequences, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the biggest thing when it comes to violating. You have to be aware. You have to be aware of your boundary. You have to verbalize your boundary in a clear and concise way. You have to be very specific on what your boundary is. So not doing it passive aggressively, not giving hints, but really saying my boundary is do not text me after 10 p.m. We just keep going back to that example. And then you have to have a consequence for that. So if somebody does continue to violate your boundaries, which people do, that is not a foreign concept. We all do it, even unintentionally. We violate boundaries. And so it's just a very common thing. But if it's something that happens consistently, then you do have to be prepared with that consequence. And sometimes that is removing yourself from the job, the relationship, the environment, whatever that is for somebody who consistently violates.
Yeah, and I'll share one quick story on that if you don't mind. So I used to go to my families for dinner every single Sunday, spend all day with them. And I love my family. They're awesome and they're great people, but sometimes it's a bit much. And so one of the things that I learned is like, I can't go every Sunday. And this was when I was, before I lived a little bit further away and in Chicago, and they're in the suburbs, but I realized, like, you know what? I can't go every Sunday because it wasn't always, but like I never knew if it was going to be what kind of day it was going to be, let's just say. And so it's little things like that sometimes too. And I would say, like, start small. Tell that uncle you see every year at Thanksgiving or Christmas or your holiday celebration who can't stop talking about, politics, or can't stop talking about, something that you just don't want to deal with, you don't want to talk about. Like, start small and be like, hey, uncle, whatever, I'm not going to talk about this with you. And then just don't. And that's super small, and you got to do it 1, maybe 2 days a year, but then you kind of build confidence and you build self-esteem around it. And I think that can be super helpful too.
Yeah, and it can be helpful to have a talking point prepared that you can transition to. So, hey, Uncle Joe, I'm not going to talk about my dating life today, but I'd love to tell you about my recent promotion. I'd love to tell you about this new show I'm watching. I'd love to tell you, have these topics prepared. So the transition, so neither one of you want to sit in that awkward silence that come after setting a boundary in that way. And so have a transition prepared.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good idea. I haven't even tried that before. I usually just leave. I just got another good question, I think, in here. It's a little longer, so I'm going to sum it up. Like, what happens if someone in your life weaponizes the boundary and, like, tries to guilt you into it, or tries to act like it isn't there? And I know you got to add consequences, but, like, where do you get the confidence to give that consequence?
And manipulators will, so disclaimer, we're all manipulators, to be clear. Like, we all have manipulative tendencies. It's just the people who do it for self-preservation versus the people who do it for control and for other tactics is the difference. But so if your boundaries are being manipulated, then there has to be an awareness around that. And if you know that somebody is repeatedly trying to weaponize your boundaries or not respecting them, you need to really stop and assess, is that somebody that you want in your life? Is that somebody you even want a relationship, whether family member, romantic partner, whatever that is, even boss? Like, is that somebody who you can keep in your life? A good way to assess if a boundary is needed is if you feel a sense of dread going into a situation, or if you feel a sense of dread when someone's around. That's a good indicator that your boundary is being violated. And so when you set it, and maybe somebody tries to dismiss it or minimize it or act like it's not a big deal, they don't get to choose that. You're the only one in your nervous system. And so you can say, like, totally get that you don't get it, but this is my boundary and I'm not negotiating on it. One other point to that is, keep in mind there's a difference between a boundary and an ultimatum. An ultimatum is about when you're trying to control somebody else, and a boundary is when you're trying to control yourself. You're just trying to maintain control of yourself and maintain your safety. And so a lot of times manipulators will say that, like, oh, so you're giving me an ultimatum. But the difference is that an ultimatum is when you are telling them what they need to do and how they need to do it for their own being. But a boundary is when you're saying, I'm protecting myself. And so that's the distinction there. That's something to be aware of as well.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I actually wanted to ask about that. And you brought up organically and I had forgotten, so that's good. Right, exactly. Last thing here I wanted to ask you, which I'm trying to get to. There's so many people joining, and and leaving and coming and going. I'm trying to make sure I got all those questions.
Triggering
And I
our
know
abandonment wounds.
I know, right? Like, I don't want anyone to feel left out. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to ask you is when when we are when we are in a relationship with a partner, I I feel like those might be some of the hardest boundaries to set. But what's an example of and this is coming from like a bunch of questions that we got in the question box, which I just also saw you can like post those.
This is like
This is my first Instagram live.
this is like a setup when you're like, I'm asking for a friend. All the
Yeah, right.
questions in the box are asking. Let's hear it, Nick. Just ask
Asking
a question.
for a friend. How do you? What's a good example of a relationship boundary with a partner that is completely fair, completely acceptable, that maybe people wouldn't even know that they could offer or set?
Sure. So it could be how much time a day you're willing to spend talking on the phone, how many texts you're willing to send a day. It could be what sexual preferences you're comfortable with, how often you're willing to have sex or don't want to have sex. It can be financial. So if they're really into spending a lot of money on dinners and you don't feel comfortable with that, it could be a conversation around, we can maybe do that once a month, but this is what I'm comfortable with. There are so many areas in a relationship where boundaries come up, even communication, their tone of voice when they're talking to you, if they raise their voice when they talk to you, and maybe you're not comfortable with that. It comes up in so many areas all day. And so again, the best way to assess where a boundary might be needed is for you to keep awareness around your body and how your body reacts when you're around this person. Is it activated? Do certain topics activate it? And again, that's a good indicator if a boundary is needed. But again, keeping in mind, you can set a boundary with somebody and you know that is what is important to you, and they can say no or violate it. It is then your choice what you do with that. And so if you remove yourself from the situation or if you continue to tolerate it, both is your choice. But in the same way you're allowed to set a boundary and should set a boundary, they're allowed to say no. But then you decide what to do with that.
That's so well said. And I actually just thought of my own question because you've mentioned it a few times, and then I'll stop. What role? So I did not know this until this summer, and I remember there was another mental health professional that I follow on social media, and it was just like one video about like the role you have to regulate your nervous system, and you've brought it up a few times. So I don't know that understanding our nervous system and the role that plays in anxiety and boundaries and all this stuff, like what role does your nervous system play, and how can you help regulate it when you are put kind of in this state of anxiety, whether it's from a boundary or any other thing?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, that could definitely get long-winded, so I'll do my best to keep it concise. But what happens with the nervous system is that your amygdala is the emotional center of your brain, and it is designed to store sensory memory. So it stores the smells and the sights and all the different things that happen with an event. And your amygdala does not know the difference between a perceived threat and an actual threat, but the purpose of it is to keep you safe. So if you're ever exposed to a situation like that again, anything that resembles it, your amygdala is going to let you know that, hey, this has been a threat in the past, and so this is probably a threat again. And that's where our nervous system gets activated, because our amygdala alerts us that you are in threat. And then the body gets flooded with cortisol, norepinephrine, adrenaline, all the things we need for our fight or flight response, which comes when a threat happens. And so what I'm really trying to say here is that the amygdala doesn't know the difference, though. So it's going to flood your body with all of those biochemicals, whether the threat is real or whether the threat is just reminding you of a previous one. And so where your responsibility comes in with regulation is that you have to stop and assess, like, is this actual threat or is it reminding me of one? And sometimes that means we have to take a couple minute time out. That means we have to step away. That means we have to remove ourselves from the situation. As you and I have talked about, if you remove yourself from a situation, you let your partner know I'll be back. But there has to be space for your body to regulate, for your prefrontal cortex to come back online. So you can use logic to assess, was this an actual threat or not? But that is what a trigger actually is when we talk about, you know, how your body is responding and if we know a boundary needs to be set. Because if your nervous system is getting activated over and over, this means your body's being reminded of a threat over and over. This means you're probably not in a safe or comfortable situation. And so sometimes we set boundaries just because we're like, we don't want our nervous system to be activated. Maybe what you're doing isn't inherently wrong, but it activates my nervous system and that doesn't feel safe to me. And so that's why I'm asking for this to change. That's why I'm asking for you not to do this anymore or to start doing something else. That was a lot of words. I tried my best to keep it concise.
No, and I think I accidentally pinned someone's questions we already answered. There was another one that popped in. So this is super interesting to me because I just learned a lot from what you just said there about how it doesn't even have to be real. Like you can basically be triggered by something that is completely different, but it's reminding your brain that you went through something, whether it's relatable or not, or related or not. And that's probably another whole Instagram live we could do on that one.
For sure.
But I think that's that's good. And for real, last question: what are 3 things? And I'll share things that I do that I've learned a lot in the last few months about like regulating my nervous system. And one of the things for me is taking a walk, moving my body and like clearing my head. And, you know, it's funny, like I used to listen to, podcast or music when I would do that. And I've actually stopped. And now I'll even put my headphones in because I don't want to be bothered. And I feel like people know that's the universal don't talk to me thing. But, I'll put my headphones in, but I won't listen to anything. And I'll turn noise cancellation on. And I will go on a long walk and I won't listen to anything. And it will become so much more clear to me versus what would happen if I reacted in that moment, whether it's a text message, whether it's someone saying something to me, whether it was something at work, whatever that is. So do you have any like quick hitters that you could share with people here as we close out Instagram Live on how to regulate naturally if you don't have the ability to do it other ways to kind of self-regulate?
Yeah, so taking a walk, I mean, that's brilliant. That's a great way to do it. Removing yourself from the threat is often the most important. Sometimes we can't do that because sometimes the threat might be your boss who you're sitting in a meeting with. Sometimes it can't be something that we can immediately remove ourselves from, but we can take a deep breath and we can have a safe place prepared in our brain. So identifying, this is a practice you could do leading up to it. You identify a safe, calm place. So it might be somewhere you go hiking or the beach or some imagery. So again, all the sensory components that if you need to just kind of like turn away for 2 seconds and pull, for me, maybe it's my dog, pull Teddy to mind of he's like so fluffy and just like brings me so much peace. I bring that to mind, Grayson there in the background with you. So that can be, if you can't actually remove yourself from the room, removing yourself mentally for a second can be helpful. Otherwise, removing yourself from the environment. Water is actually really effective for regulating the nervous system because it sends a message to the brain. Like if I'm sitting here drinking water, then I'm probably not running from a saber-toothed tiger, so I'm probably okay. So water, maybe getting a snack, physical activity is a great way to reduce that panic. So like you're saying, going for a walk. Of course, breathing, that's the most common thing that people say. And of course, to a certain extent, but you just have to ensure like the exhalation is longer than the inhalation, that you're like breathing in, but really breathing it all out. And you have to do it about 7 to 10 times for it to actually be effective enough to start to send messages to the brain. And so that's the thing with breathing is people are like, well, I took a couple of breaths and it didn't help. Yeah, because there's a little more of a science to it. So be aware of that if that's going to be your go-to.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that about the breathing either, because sometimes I'll do like, I don't feel any better. I'm going for a walk. But
common.
So to close out here, because I put this on my story, I have to bring this guy up to say hi to everybody.
in.
And say hi.
Oh, I get Teddy back on Sunday, and then we'll have to do an IG live with Teddy and Grayson.
We should a relatable conversation with dogs. I bet they'll complain they're not getting enough treats, not getting enough attention, not getting enough pets, all that stuff.
All the
He won't even
boundaries
look at the
they set
camera.
up as.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
Grayson is a lot more docile than Teddy. Teddy, he is going to give y'all a run for your money if he shows up on our IG live.
This guy's just so like, he's so dramatic about all of it. He just can't be bothered by participating in.
So
he's literally like,
cute.
put me back down.
Well, maybe that's his boundary. He's like, yo, Nick, I don't want to be part of your IG live. Could you please put me down?
Yeah. I put him through the torture of some videos this week, and I think he's just done. He's over it. So
he's spent.
But
hopefully his salary was good.
Awesome. Yeah, right. He keeps the lights on these days. So, but I want to thank you guys all so much for coming. Also, like, honestly, I don't even know what happens to this after we stop recording, but leave comments. And I know I personally am going to release this as a bonus podcast on Conversations with Nick Thompson on YouTube and anywhere that you get your podcasts. I know, Liz, you want to actually pump your podcast?
Yes. So Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. You can find it on YouTube. At Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick is my handle on there. And then also on all major podcast platforms, you can find it under that Relatable Relationships Unfiltered. And yeah, otherwise we'll save it, I think, on our feed. I mean, back to the boomer conversation.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll more comments on that. And I'm sure we'll figure it out.
We had some clarifying comments on it as well. Apparently, after 2000 is Gen Z. And then we still don't know when millennials are, but we know we're not Gen Z, so
we just know
that's a win.
We're old and we don't know how to do Instagram Live. That's all we know.
Yeah.
But
hey,
before we wrap up,
yes.
Okay. We have an exciting announcement coming everyone's direction here soon, next week, maybe.
I think Monday was the plan, but we'll see what happens.
See. Figure that out.
Right.
Yes, but
So,
Nick and I are partnering on something that's really exciting, something based in authenticity, which is a huge passion of both of ours. And yeah, we're excited to bring it to you. Nick, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm super excited to bring it to you. And one of the things I think I've realized, and I've shared this with maybe some of you listening on over DM or in some way, but like one of the big things that I've noticed is there's a lot of pressure every which way coming off of a reality TV show as popular as the one that I was on. And as hard as it is sometimes, like I tried to stay true to myself the whole time. And I think I've learned so much from this experience on how important that is. And when we talk about that, and we've talked about that on our podcast, we've talked about that in real life. Not the podcasts aren't real life, but like we've talked about that outside of being recorded, and there's so much there for all of us to like really sort of hone in on who we are as people, what our core values are, and how we stick to them. And it comes to it relates to everything. So very excited about some of the stuff that we're going to be doing together and some of the other partnerships that we have.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is, yeah, I love how you're saying that these experiences, on Instagram, and yes, to your point, podcasts are real life to a certain extent, but there's also a lot more, as we all know, going on behind the scenes, and that people, with the highlight reel that they are living behind. So we're excited to be able to bring you some stuff that is based more in humanity and based in our desire to show up as real humans.
Exactly. And I think first and foremost, like I always say this, I say this all the time forever, but we're all just human beings trying to figure this out. So we might as well help each other and lead with kindness. So that's going to be my end message, I guess, is lead with kindness, especially this time of year when so many people struggle, so many people are not able to hit the expectations that are set. So just remember that, be kind. You never know. What someone's going through. I think we all learned that yesterday. It doesn't matter what you post on social media. It doesn't matter how you live your life. It doesn't matter if you have family or friends around you all the time. Like, you just don't know what someone's going through. So spread kindness, spread love, take up space when you need it for yourself and with others as well.
Absolutely. and set your damn boundaries and hold them. Have your consequences prepared.
Yes.
That's how I'm gonna end it. Oh, and I apologize to all the boomers I offended. I'll end it on that note as well.
And I apologize to all the millennials I've offended. So.
No, I think you offended the Gen Zers, to be fair. But
I probably did.
On that note, we're out.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me on another episode of Conversations with Nick Thompson. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to follow us and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Links can be found in the description below, and we can't wait to see you next time.